Hi, my name is Mia Wood. I am a visiting lecturer here at Bridgewater State University. I'm working out of the philosophy department. I had the opportunity to conduct a workshop during the fall 2015 Teaching and Learning Conference hosted by the Faculty Development Office as well as the Office of Teaching and Learning. And I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity. The focus this year was on the liberal arts tradition. So what I wanted to do was gain some insight from my colleagues at Bridgewater about how they connect a common problem that occurs in the classroom to a larger problem that students run into in the liberal arts tradition. So more specifically, what I was interested in looking at was how faculty address the experience students have of misery, or the experience students have of kind of hitting a wall when they are confused. And one typical response to confusion is to just shut down, right? To not sort of persevere, struggle with how to make sense of what's confusing them. And it's oftentimes the case that they do this because they don't either know that they have the relevant skills or tools to solve their confusion, or the confusion is kind of overwhelming and they don't really have those tools. So I wanted to find out from folks how they deal with that in their classroom, and then how they might find a common theme among the solutions that they have that we could apply to a student's confusion over how to make sense of their core requirements. So this video will walk you through the presentation that I gave, but also will cover the ideas that came out of this presentation, and I'm excited to share them with you. So again, thanks very much to the Office of Teaching and Learning and Faculty Development for giving me the opportunity to work with my colleagues on a topic that I think is really interesting, and within a subject that is the liberal arts tradition that I think is incredibly important. And I'm so glad also that Bridgewater is committed to being a liberal arts institution. So let's get started. So the title of the session was Mastering Misery, or the Productive Struggle in the Liberal Arts. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm interested in talking about and finding out what people think are ways of not only helping students develop or tap into skills that allow them to work through problems, but also allow them to make sense of what is oftentimes a really overwhelming experience in core courses or in general education courses. So what I'm going to do is, as you'll probably notice as I go along, is basically steal from all sorts of people and try to synthesize those ideas into a thesis about what it means to value the experience of living with uncertainty, intellectual uncertainty, and having that be an important component of the experience that we have connecting the work that we do in our lower division or mid-level GE courses. So I want to start with a quote from Immanuel Kant. And although we all know that the liberal arts tradition well predates the 18th century, which is when Kant is working, I think that what Kant has to say about an enlightened mind is really quite relevant to the claim that I would like to make and the investigation that our group engaged in concerning mastering misery. So in a famous essay, an answer to the question, what is enlightenment, which, by the way, was an entry in an essay competition that did not win, but is still a classic in the literature. Kant writes, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of the Enlightenment is therefore, sapere aude, have the courage to use your own understanding." So a couple of ideas here I think are worth pulling out. One is the notion that when we have liberated ourselves through education, we are able to use our own reasoning as opposed to continuously seeking the guidance of others, the experts, for example, in a field. The other idea that I want to hone in on is the risk of using one's own reason. In other words, when we say dare to be wise, we're saying that we're taking a risk to step out on our own and be our own autonomous thinker. And as you can probably imagine, for our students, probably because it was also the case for us, these are no small feats. And so I think that one of the goals that we have to always have in mind, not just in our own courses in the core or general education curriculum, but across the curriculum, that is across the tradition that we have at Bridgewater, is to encourage our students to be self-sufficient, to take intellectual risks. If they can't do it here, then one wonders where they can do it. So I want to set the stage also, not just from the standpoint of a philosophical framework, but also from the ground. I had a conversation this semester, fall 2015, with a student who had come in to ask for help with logic. And at one point, I don't remember where the conversation was such that she made this comment, but she said, "I don't understand why I have to take all these courses that have nothing to do with my major." And I asked, "What's your major?" And she said, "Communications. I want to be a UN interpreter." And I said, "Wonderful. So let's talk about what all of these GE courses, what all of these core courses are meant to do for you so that your major is even more robust than it would be if you just took courses in your major, and how your experience is going to transform you, and you are going to be working in this area of interpreting. And so the more breadth and depth of understanding you have across any number of areas, the better you'll be at what you do." Now, I don't know if that went over very well with her, but at least I hope the seed was planted. So here's another example. We oftentimes have students say, after we talk about an idea, that they get it, but they can't explain it. So whether it's written or verbal communication, they have trouble articulating what they recognize as an idea that makes sense to them. Or they are going along just fine and they're articulating ideas just fine, and then suddenly everything falls apart. They sort of slam into a wall of confusion, and it's misery making. It's awful. They don't like it. And who does? Who is comfortable with the uncertainty of being intellectually confused? So, one of the things that I think we all need to understand is that when we're learning a new territory in a field, and this is particularly the case with introductory level courses, this is particularly the case with survey courses, let's say, at the core level, we're asking people to think about and absorb and assimilate new and strange ideas. And it's probably the case that if we imagine being dropped into a totally unfamiliar place with no compass or GPS, we might panic. How do we orient ourselves? How do we find something familiar so that we can figure out how to make our way back to what makes sense to us? Most of the time, instead of trying to find a connection to something familiar and then sort of crab walk our way back to the unfamiliar, we're desperate to get out. I'm reminded, for example, of my poor cats who grew up. They were born in and grew up in right smack in the city of Los Angeles. And sure, they had a backyard and they had a house and they could climb trees. But you can probably imagine their shock at being released into the house in Rhode Island where I am now, and there's just a set of smells and sights and sounds that they've never experienced before. And of course, their response is to run, right? It's just panic. So it's understandable that when students run into confusion for whatever reason, maybe their response is to shut down, to panic, to get out. And we're going to talk about a number of ways that I think we can address this in a general sense. So I'm going to come back to, for example, the idea of training oneself or being trained to think slowly, meticulously, methodically, systematically, procedurally, not skipping steps. So, one of the questions that I have asked people to consider, and then we went on to work on this in the workshop part, but before we got there, was to think about what the most common confusion is that your students have in a specific core course you conduct. So think about what your discipline is, and then what one of the core courses is that you teach, and what's the one thing that almost invariably goes wrong for the students, and there's no way around it. It's just the way it is. Do you have a concrete way of dealing with it? And I'll explain more about what I mean by that in a moment, as well as explain how you might generalize your approach, your concrete approach, such that maybe it could be a principle you use in similar situations. So I mentioned that when you think about students being dropped into new territory or students running up against an idea that's unfamiliar, that this is also a phenomenon, if you will, of what happens oftentimes when they try to think about what they're doing with their core courses, right? They typically are geared toward a major, and even institutionally and culturally outside of the institution, students are prepped to think about what they're going to do with their life, right? So they don't think in terms of the way in which the liberal arts will make their lives better in a sort of nebulous way. They think instead, oh, I've got a bunch of boxes I got to tick off because I've got to take these core courses. So, it's very often the case that when they run into trouble, they just sort of shut down, right? So the question is, what do we do concretely as well as in a more general way to encourage them to learn or to develop or hone a skill of grappling with this difficulty? And it's going to be something that they take everywhere with them and that they will use to make sense of their liberal arts tradition. And in fact, it's a skill that is just part of what it means to be liberally educated. So one of the things that I like to do if I know that misery is coming is I might say, you are going to be miserable. In fact, most of the time that we spend together, and most of the time that you're reading the text, or if you're in a logic course, you're practicing the exercises, you're going to feel confused and frustrated and lost, and it's just going to be miserable. But a lot of life is like that. And so rather than not addressing the misery, we're going to learn how you can articulate what it is that's bothering you and how you might go about solving this problem for yourself, so that when you enter into a situation that's confusing or that is disorienting, you don't shut down, but you say to yourself confidently, oh, I can figure out a way out of this. In fact, the better you are at this, the more comfortable you will be with uncertainty and not worry about the fact that you don't have the answer, because you have a way of getting an answer, or you have a way of getting closer to an answer once you develop the skills that we're talking about. So another question that I asked the participants was whether or not they create the misery, or if they simply use the misery that emerges as an opportunity to help extend mastering their uncertainty in a way that they can take with them to their other GE courses. Now, at this point, I wanted to pause and make sure that we're all clear on some basics of the liberal arts tradition. So we know that we call ourselves a liberal arts institution. We know that we ask students to take courses across a liberal arts set of offerings. But what is that tradition? Well, obviously, what I'm going to say is woefully superficial, but it kind of gives us a sense of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about being liberally educated. So, way back in Greek and Roman times, a free citizen studied to develop his full potential in order to properly participate in his society. So the notion of a liberally educated person was that a person was now freely able to participate in civic life. And the areas of study were devoted to that, right? So logic, rhetoric, and grammar. And this is, in terms of the scope of what we see now, just teeny tiny, right? As we began to learn more, so for example, during the period, the pre-Enlightenment period, or the pre-early modern period in philosophy, we have, for example, a liberal arts education that extended to areas in mathematics, music, and astronomy, as well as logic, rhetoric, grammar, right? And then eventually, so let's kind of fast forward to like, the 1800s. I probably would want to defer to an education historian, but certainly by the time we're looking at the gentleman's education at Cambridge or Oxford, or educations that you might get in France or Germany, there was a canon, right? So you would have Latin and Greek. You probably have Shakespeare. You would have philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, and so forth. But the scope of the learning was still small enough to where there's this sort of shared intellectual vocabulary. So we could think about a liberally educated person as somebody who had a body of knowledge that was pretty common across individuals, at least in the Western tradition. But when we think about what that looks like today, it's a very different picture. So, we have, fortunately, a much more diversified, set of texts to look at. We have the scope of what we can know and be able to do is so huge that it seems impossible to compass it in anything like what we would call a canon. So it seems as though the emphasis now is not so much on trying to know everything about everything, because that's just not really possible, but instead to emphasize the freedom part of a liberal arts tradition. As we take these courses across the liberal arts, we become much freer thinkers. In other words, our minds are thereby liberated from ignorance. Our minds are liberated from prejudices, preconceived ideas of various sorts. And so the emphasis is oftentimes not just on a body of knowledge, but on certain intellectual habits of mind. And so when you are a liberally educated person, you are someone who can think well across a number of topics. And if you weren't there on the day that we participated in this conference, you did not know, or you didn't get to hear both Dean Krebs and President Clark talk about their visions of a liberal arts education, although Robin did post the video, I think, of their presentation. So that's very helpful. But one thing I want to focus on with respect to this notion of a liberally educated individual is this. President Clark talked about, which most everybody should know, the fact that employers want a liberal arts traditionally educated, if that's the right way to put it, individual. In other words, they want the skills that we focus on across the liberal arts. It's not that they want somebody who has a narrowly focused, for example, vocational degree, or that you have to have a degree in advertising or marketing in order to work in advertising or marketing. What employers want, but they don't realize that this is what we're giving them in a liberal arts degree. They want students who can think about things in ways that can be applied across various content. So part of what we're doing when we are educating people in the liberal arts tradition is we're cultivating habits of mind. Now, let me hone in on the habit of mind that I think is essential to the misery that we were talking about a little bit ago. When we think of concepts like grit, or thinking of learning as a process, not a goal with a termination point or a fixed state of knowledge, when we talk about what some people call a growth mindset, for example, being comfortable with uncertainty, valuing inquiry, seeking or being open to discovering new connections, willing to engage in slow, meticulous, methodical thinking, willing to risk being wrong about a line of reasoning or the termination of a line of reasoning or a concept, that's all a part of what it is to cope with the misery we feel and our students feel when we run into stuff we don't know about, and that makes us really, really nervous or anxious. So we took all of this and we looked at all of these questions. I'll walk through the questions with you, and then I want to provide you with an example that I offered. And then I'm going to return to the questions and talk a little bit about what our group found in our discussion of the topic Mastering Misery, both at the course level and at the core level. In other words, across the liberal arts tradition. So as I mentioned earlier, I asked folks to think about one course they teach in the general education or core curriculum, and what their discipline was, and then describe what the course is about and what they want the student to get out of the course. And then I asked them to think about one example of a problem in that GE course, that core course, that their students run into almost invariably. It confuses them, stops them in their tracks, hits a wall. What's that example? And then what do they do when they recognize that there's this problem? So what is a concrete response? And then what's the general idea behind the response? In other words, what is it about this approach that you think is successful for the student? I also asked folks to think about whether or not they try to throw students off balance, right? So there are going to be times when students come into a course and they have a pretty robust content knowledge base. They may have a pretty robust skill set that's relevant to the course, but it's not a bad idea to throw them off balance in such a way that you're creating a bit of misery for them and then helping them work through it so that they can then take that skill and apply it elsewhere. I also asked how actively people engage in the process of when they're thinking about their course, of whether or not that course, or how that course rather, fits in with the core curriculum. And then I also was curious about, and this might seem a bit tangential, but curious about how, whether or not there is a component of, for lack of a better word, professionalization in that core course. So, for example, when you're in a chemistry course, do you talk about thinking as a chemist? When you're in a poetry course, do you talk about thinking as a poet? When you're in an architecture course, do you talk about thinking as an architect? You know, what does it mean to think as a or an thus and such? And that may also help orient students' thinking in terms of making a connection positively or negatively, a compare contrast between thinking as a in one discipline versus another across the core. Now, we didn't have a huge group, so we didn't go off into pairs, but we did develop answers to questions 8, 9, and 10. So before we get started on the answers that everyone came up with, I wanted to say, well, here's an example of what I have in mind. So in the Foundations of Logical Reasoning course, that's Philosophy 111, one of the areas of study is the concept of validity as it applies in, or as it plays out in propositional logic. So here we have a syllogism, and it goes like this. If I am a BSU student, I attend a Massachusetts university. I attend a Massachusetts university, so I must be a BSU student. Now, at this point in the course, students know what an argument is. They know what a conclusion is. They're able to identify the conclusion of this argument. But what they tend to think of is that the argument is, quote, true or false, right, rather than valid or invalid. And they also tend to think that this argument is perfectly good because all the sentences are true. And so then what I do is I ask them what they think about this argument. If I have 10 pennies, I have 10 cents. I have 10 pennies, so I must have, or sorry, I have 10 cents. I'm trying to make it valid. So let me start over. If I have 10 pennies, I have 10 cents. I have 10 cents, so I must have 10 pennies. And at this point, there's uproar. No, that's not true. And what's not true? It's not true that I must have 10 pennies. I could have 2 nickels. I could have a dime. I could have a nickel and 5 pennies, right? And I say, okay, well, but you thought the first argument was perfectly good. And in logic, good has a technical meaning, but for right now, we just say, well, you know, you think this is a good argument. I said, well, what's the difference between the two? Well, in the first case, in the first one, all the sentences are true. And in the second one, the last sentence doesn't have to be true. And so we push on this a little bit more until they begin to see the general idea, which in this case is distinguishing the form of an argument from its content. Now, there are a number of ways that this can go. I mean, I could use a math example, which might scare some people, or I could use shapes, for example. I oftentimes will use examples from movies, you know, a movie clip or a song or something like that. But whatever it is that's going to get them to realize that there's a problem, that, and they don't understand why the first argument seems so wonderful and the second one seems so obviously not wonderful, and yet they have the same form. Right, so this is what I then asked our group to use as kind of a a model for their example and their concrete, solution, and then the general idea. So what I'm going to do now is turn back to the workshop questions, and what we'll do is talk about what our group uncovered. Now, before proceeding to address the discussion that we had and the results at which we arrived, I want to thank moderator and participant John Cusick from English, as well as participants Robin Tierney, Ernie Cherwinski, and Bob Burns. John and Robin are from English, and Ernie is from math, and Bob is from communication studies. So we certainly had some core disciplines represented. Now, as I mentioned before, we didn't get into the details of all the questions that I had. I probably had more questions than we had time to answer, but I think we still honed in on the difficulty that students run into, what that looks like, how it's addressed, and then how we can take the process of resolving the difficulty, mastering misery, becoming comfortable with uncertainty, and applying that across the curriculum, the core curriculum. So what I found was, in some ways, not surprising. For math, for example, students are confused before they even walk in the door. It's the psychological, the phobia, I should say, that psychological state is what they come to the classroom with for the most part. So, as Ernie pointed out, they sort of hit the wall before they walk in the door. And so he doesn't have to do anything to create confusion. They kind of walk in the door like deer in headlights. And as you are aware, probably from your own experience, but certainly from the classroom, when you run into that wall of confusion, it is a sort of mental paralysis. It's hard to think your way out of that. And yet that's precisely what we're doing in our courses, is we're thinking about things. And Bob mentioned that, like most of us, students have an anxiety about kind of being put on the spot. They're in the spotlight, everybody's watching them, and then they're supposed to say something that's organized and coherent and thoughtful and all the rest of it. So both math and public speaking classes seem to involve a sort of a pre-given psychological state. Then in John's first year seminar and Robin's first year seminar, respectively, there are specific troubles that they run into. So John, for example, mentioned that when they're reading Walden, they have trouble connecting to the text, just making sense of what they're reading. And for any of us who are focused on texts in our disciplines, a lot of times students will say, this is written in English, or this is translated into English. I read English. I understand the words individually. I can read the sentence as a whole, but I don't know what it means. This is a very common confusion that students have, and it's really frustrating for them. And they start thinking about doing their laundry or how they're going to go have pizza, or when things don't make sense right away, they just kind of shut down. Robin mentioned that students will often say they can't find any refereed sources. They're just not out there. And so they stop, they give up. And then I gave an example, as you saw and heard a little bit ago, but another example is that students think too fast for their own good. They're too smart for their own good. They tend to speed through things. And this is maybe not the confusion itself, but it's what results it's what causes confusion. They think so fast that they tend to run into trouble, and then they don't know why. Now, there are a number of ways in which each of us concretely address our problems. But I think that the following were the most telling. So, what Ernie does is he connects to the students as an individual. He doesn't walk into the classroom as though, he's the math professor, he knows it all, and he's here to judge them. Instead, he talks about his own experience learning math, and the struggles that he had. So he makes a really personal, individual connection. What Bob does is give students exercises and tips that he specifically developed for reducing anxiety. He talked about, for example, a football player who had come to Bridgewater to play football, who then got hurt and so was out of the game and was effectively lost. The student did not have the sort of academic, I don't want to say credentials, but basically the student was ill prepared, right? Wasn't at college readiness, and so was really in a state in this public speaking course. And one of the ways in which Bob worked with this student was to try to reduce the anxiety that the student felt, and hope that this would then be able to travel with that student to other courses. John, in our discussion, had also mentioned, for example, helping the student by way of showing the connections between the student's own experiences and how an academic life. So, how can you, for example, in a public speaking class, bring your own life to bear in a formal environment and sort of transform, well, not transform, but sort of convert, for presentation purposes, that experience into an academic environment. John talked about his own concrete solution. Actually, he gave two examples of solutions which were really useful. One of them should be something that we all do when we're dealing with difficult texts to read. I know, for example, that certainly in philosophy, I'm sure it's also the case in economics and political science and all sorts of areas, in various English literature classes. They're very difficult texts to read. Whether it's poems or Shakespeare and the not having been updated for the 21st century, students have trouble reading the text, and so he will pick out a passage or a sentence and analyze the text, the passage with the student, sort of model in front of them, and with them what it's like to take the text apart. He also gave another terrific example with respect to adjusting an assignment. So he said he had a student from Cape Verde, and this student, had no life experience that looked like what Walden's talking about. And so, she's trying to understand Walden's world, and she can't understand it insofar as she's brand new to this environment and there's no touchstone for her. And so what John did was he adjusted the assignment and basically asked her to, I think if I remember correctly, to basically talk about the Cape Verde experience, right? So what is this student's Cape Verde, just like what is Walden's Pond, right? Then Robin mentioned talking about taking that same student who said, "I can't find anything, and I'm giving up." Right? The class worked on the research together. So whatever it was that the student was supposed to do, whatever refereed resources the student was supposed to find, that the whole class worked on it together, and they collaborated in terms of talking about how they might approach finding these sources. And in fact, they were successful. It took a bit of doing, but they were successful. And so the student was able to see that, yeah, it was really tough. So it's not like the student wasn't trying, but that it was worth continuing on because there was light at the end of the tunnel. And then what I mentioned was asking students to take examples that make sense to them and then see if they can recognize the form. So an example would be this. If I say, not both the Patriots and the Celtics are football teams, does it make sense to say that that's the same thing as saying either the Patriots are not a football team or the Celtics are not a football team? Another example would be neither the Patriots nor the Celtics are hockey teams. So that means the Patriots are not a hockey team and the Celtics are not a hockey team. And then I talked about some other ways in which by way of examples that should make sense to people, to sort of forcing them to slow down a bit and look at the structure of what they are saying, of what the sentence says, rather, instead of simply drawing an inference. And to that end, I used an example where when we're trying to talk about the structure of the sentence, some dogs are animals, students want to say, oh, but all dogs are animals. They draw that inference, which is not a legit inference to draw in terms of structure. And so then I will give them another sentence of the same form. So some dogs are animals. They want to conclude, therefore, all dogs are animals. And I said, well, would you say the same thing? Would you be able to make the same inference if you said some dogs are pit bulls, all dogs are pit bulls? No, you wouldn't do that. So then they're forced to slow down and look at the structure of the original sentence. And that's my crab walking example. So we then generalized, right? So what we're trying to do is talk about concrete ways and general ways of dealing with that wall of confusion that students run into or walk into the class having already run into. And we agreed that the skill of mastering one's misery is essential not only to success in each course, but to making sense of one's core requirements and one's entire college experience. In other words, the skill of mastering one's misery is a skill that involves cultivating certain habits of mind. So I'll say more about that in a moment. And this, we believe, should be cultivated in all areas of the core curriculum so that students don't feel like they're just ticking off their requirements without seeing deep connections between them and the impact they have on the student's life. We talked about the importance of mastering misery through developing the confidence, the character to persevere in the face of uncertainty, right? So that the student becomes just habituated to meeting challenges or obstacles or confusions, whatever it is, not with defeat, but with maybe a sort of piqued interest, like, hey, this is neat. This is a puzzle for me to solve, something like that. That they are in our core courses developing a robust toolkit of strategies, not just a single strategy. And that's why I was really keen to find out what people's general ideas were in solving particular problems, because these are strategies that should cut across the curriculum and not just work in one class. Now, it's true that, if you're going to solve a certain math problem, you need a certain math formula, presumably, but the process whereby you determine which formula to use and the process whereby you figure out what sort of problem you've got involves a skill that cuts across not just math courses, but also, let's say, humanities courses where you're spending your time reading texts, not calculating, for example. And this is also where I think the notion of learning to think as a thus and such comes to the fore. You could say, for example, in a certain course, oh, this is like this class where I tend to think this way, and I can use it here. And now I see why these courses are similar to each other. You know, lest we forget, if I may point out, that our curriculum is grouped in terms of disciplines, but in so very many ways, our disciplines are arbitrary. There's much more overlap, not clear boundaries in very many cases between disciplines. Someone mentioned, by the way, in the discussion after the panel with Dean Krebs and President Clark, that we tend to silo. I think this was a sociologist who mentioned this. We tend to think in silos because we physically have our schools broken up and our departments are, grouped together, our disciplines, our department members are grouped together within a discipline, and those are separate from, other departments and so forth. And so this sort of physical or spatial distinction tends to bleed into our thinking about these courses and disciplines, when in fact there's less rigid demarcation in reality. In addition, we talked about the significance of becoming aware of oneself as someone who has the mindset, someone who has cultivated the intellectual habit of methodically, meticulously, systematically approaching difficulties. So a lot of people talk about this in terms of metacognition. Philosophically, I'm a little bit hesitant to use that language, but that's perfectly acceptable language in any case. But this has to do with instead of running away when one meets a problem, instead of shutting down when one meets a problem, that one is willing to slowly work through the difficulty, and one is willing to do this because one has been shown how it can be done, and one is successful in doing it oneself. And that may be under supervision, under guidance, but then the better the student gets at it, that they don't need us anymore for that, right? We want our students to be educated in such a way that they can think for themselves, and they don't need us to, if you will, do their thinking for them. We don't want to do that. And then lastly, that the process is the focus of mastering misery. And that means that we have to continuously work on getting the students' attention on the process, not on the grade. And that's tough stuff, but we can, for example, generate exercises or activities or assignments where that is the case. So that's our second bullet point. But first, a proposal that John made, which I think is worth highlighting, and I hope that it will be taken seriously because it's terrific. He'd like to have a discussion about how we can bring the notion of a productive struggle, or persevering in the face of uncertainty, or developing the character, the cultivating the habit of mind of perseverance, to the fore of our curricular discussions, so that we might be able to measure it, assess it, and communicate it. And then, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the group also discussed the importance of assignments that reward the process that results in the grade, so that students become more interested in what they're learning rather than what the grade is. We all know that in our core courses, it's often the case that the students basically just, what do I need to know, or what do I need to do to get past this, to get through this, to pass the course. And not on the process of learning the material and integrating it into their lives. I hope you found this video to, if nothing else, reinforce what you already know, or maybe give you some ideas about what you might want to do in helping your students master misery both within a core course as well as across the curriculum, and maybe rejuvenate our thinking about what it means to be a liberally educated individual. I'm so very grateful to the Office of Teaching and Learning and the Office of Faculty Development for the opportunity to work with my colleagues on this project, the opportunity to present at this year's conference. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you about campus.